All right, so here's example number 2. The first thing we always do is factor the top and the bottom. The top is already factored. The bottom is a difference of squares. Very easy to factor. It's x plus 3 and x minus 3. So now I'm going to be able to answer all those questions using one of those two forms. The first thing we always look for are vertical asymptotes. For your vertical asymptotes, it's always whatever makes the denominator 0. I got 2 of them this time. X is negative 3, x is positive 3. So if we're drawing this picture, I would go to a positive 3 and do a vertical dotted line. Make sure you label that. And I go to x equals a negative 3. Do a dotted line and label that. Next thing are the zeros or x-intercepts. X-intercepts are whatever makes the top 0. What can you put in there? That'd be negative 1, 0. So at negative 1, 0, there's a point. This graph's got to go through there. And before you go any farther, you can already look at your sign chart and see it's divided into sections. You've got everything below, less than negative 3, between negative 3 and negative 1, between 1 and 3, and above 3. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 sections that we've divided up. Everything else is just going to help us draw the picture, but it doesn't have anything to do with our sign chart. So let's just kind of jump ahead. For the sign chart, if you think about it, the numbers that we're going to be checking are negative 3, negative 1, and 3. Something less than negative 3, something between negative 3 and negative 1, between negative 1 and 3, and bigger than 3, because that's what happens. Zeros from the top and the bottom are called critical numbers for our sign chart. So those are our critical numbers. So I'll stop there and go back up to what I was doing. Let's finish this up. So are there any horizontal or oblique asymptotes? Horizontal or oblique asymptotes, what's the rule for horizontal asymptotes? Horizontal asymptote says if the exponent on bottom is bigger than the one on top, which is the case here. I got a 2 on bottom and only a 1 on top. It says your horizontal asymptote is y equals 0. So at y equals 0, which is that axis, there's going to be an asymptote. Now the question's going to come up. I'm going to label that where you can see it. The question's going to come up. Wait. How am I going to have a point here and not cross the asymptote? Horizontal asymptotes only deal with the farthest left and the farthest right. In the middle, you can cross this asymptote. That's not the same as vertical asymptotes. Vertical asymptotes you can't cross at all. But horizontal and oblique asymptotes are for when x is getting really, really small or when x is getting really, really big. And that's it. All right? You'll see what I mean by that in just a moment. The next thing we're supposed to look for are the y-intercepts. That's where you plug in zeros there and there. It leaves you 1 over negative 9. It's negative 1/9. That means right here, it's going to be really, really close to 0, but just below the axis. That's my y-intercept. And now do the sign chart. Well, notice we just picked a number between negative 1 and 3. We picked that 0 right there, and we found out that's negative because the answer came out to be a negative. Now pick a number bigger than 3. Bigger than 3 would be a 4. If we check 4. If I do g of 4, just looking for the signs, it's easier to see it right here. That'd be 4 plus 1, 4 plus 3, and 4 minus 3. That would be a positive over a positive times a positive. You see that? That's a positive 5, positive 7, positive 1. It's all 3 positives. Since everything's positive, everything up here is positive. Now pick a number between negative 1 and negative 3, like a negative 2. If you plug in a negative 2, I'm trying to find a place I can write, and I'll put it up here. If I plug in g of negative 2, put it in the factored form, it's negative 2 plus 1, negative 2 plus 3, negative 2 minus 3. That would be a negative 1 over 1 times negative 5. If you have an even number of negatives, your final answer is positive. If you have an even or odd number of negatives, the answer is negative. Since I have two negatives, that means this area is going to be positive. Now pick something out here. If you plug in -4 and plug that in, that should be a -4 plus 1, -4 plus 3, -4 minus 3. That's a negative over a negative times a negative. 3 negatives is a negative. So here's how to read those sign charts. We said, according to that sign chart, anything to the left of -3 is below the axis. Down here it's going to be below the axis. It's got to hug that asymptote and that asymptote. It's going to look like that. Between -3 and 1, I know that's a 0, which means the graph's got to go through that point. This sign chart says that area is positive, which means it's going to be above the graph and hug that asymptote. Then over here, it's got to be below the axis between -1 and 3. It's got to go through the y-intercept and go over here and hug that asymptote. And this last section from 3 bigger, it's going to be positive. It's got to hug this asymptote and that asymptote. It's going to look like that. And there's your picture.